to a bonus episode of the 3% podcast. To be, as part of 3%'s dedication to covering nonfiction and translation this month, I was able to get Sean Bai and Antonia Lloyd-Jones to come on to talk about Polish Reportage, which is of great interest to me, being Polish, and also because we're going to be doing a series of Polish Reportage with the two of you. So thank you for coming on, first of all.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, our pleasure.
And congratulations, Antonia. You just found out recently that you're on the Man Booker International shortlist for the Olga Tokarczuk book, Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead.
Thank you. Yes, it's very exciting.
Yeah, do you think she can win 2 in a row?
Well, I don't know how these things work. I always think of these prizes as just existing to promote literature generally, so it seems to me unlikely, but it means I have the lack of anxiety. I can go and enjoy the gala party without worrying about winning, and I don't have to fake my smile when somebody else wins. So, it takes a lot of the angst out of it.
That's true. I can see that. That makes complete sense. I keep getting invited to the gala, and I wish I could go, but yeah, I'll just fly over to London for a quick little jaunt.
Why not?
It seems like a good time for a bunch of books. I bet it's amazing, though.
It's fun. I mean, they changed the location this year. It's always been, so far, at the Victoria and Albert Museum, twice in an amazing room with Raphael pictures all around the walls. But now it's at the Roundhouse, which is a place where the trams used to turn around when they existed,
right.
Which is a kind of a theatre and a big venue in Camden.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. It'll be different this year.
That's cool. And is it the Man Booker this year still, or did it switch after this? I can't remember when they changed their name.
It's next year. Right?
Next year.
This is still
okay.
Yeah.
Last Man one.
That's what I wanted. I wanted to make sure I said it right before. You're like, no, it's Crank Drive or whatever that new thing is.
Yes.
Should be fun. But anyways, so talk a little bit about Polish Reportage. And I think I have a couple general questions to ask you guys, because I'm not sure how much our listeners and readers know about this particular genre of writing. So just generally, what is Polish Reportage, and how do you distinguish it from other forms of nonfiction or American journalism?
Shall I start on that?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, well, Polish literature has this very strong genre that they call reportage, and we, for want of a better word, call reportage. And it is essentially journalism of a fairly broad kind, very literary, and quite often, putting it in a nutshell, there will be books by reportage authors that perhaps give an overall picture of a whole country or a whole situation, I like to say from the ground up, by talking to very, very ordinary people and what their lives are like. So it's not about the big politicians or the famous names. It's about what life is like for society at its roots.
And it's a specific method of storytelling as well. It's very, as Antonia said, it's very literary. It's very consciously crafted.
Yeah.
And in terms of how it's different from American journalism, I think that Polish reportage titles that have been published in the United States have sometimes been misread as novels. So they're that level of literary quality that it feels almost like you're reading a fictional story, even though it's not. It's really, Polish reportage is really its own separate tradition. To my knowledge, it didn't come from another tradition. I don't think it's necessarily had influence on other traditions, but there are kind of parallel traditions in other places. What Svetlana Alexievich does has things in common with Polish reportage. In Latin America, they have a genre called the kronika, which it's stylistically very different, but sort of takes a similar approach. And in the United States, I often compare it to certain types of radio journalism we have, like This American Life or Radio Lab, even things like The Moth Story Hour, these things where you're taking individual stories, nonfiction stories, and you're telling them not in a fictionalized way, but in a consciously crafted, literarized way.
Yeah.
Yes. You can also say what it isn't. It isn't like our kind of straightforward travel writing, and it isn't like our straightforward factual news reporting either. And very often it emerges out of having to write around the censorship, which is interesting, the countries that Sean was mentioning, because they're also places where journalists have had to say things in a cryptic way or to protect their sources. So its origins are partly in that.
Yeah, under communism, it was a way that you could talk about what was going on in society and what was going on in politics while still having plausible deniability. You know, you could say, oh, well, I'm not talking about the system. I'm just talking about this one person and what happened to them. That
makes a lot of sense. One thing that you remind me of as you're talking is that your book, the book that you translated, History of a Disappearance, the Story of a Forgotten Polish Town, by Filip Springer. And I used that in my class last year, 2 years ago, whenever it was. The students all thought it was a novel. And we're very convinced of that until you talk to them. Like, they just said interpret it that way because it does have those sort of elements to it, but there's no plot per se except for the town, vanishing. And the characters don't all recur in a way that it would work in a fiction book. So they were they approached it like that too. I think the same thing happens with Selkie, the book that we did, the Nowicki book. That the people see that as a novel, and it's kind of not.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a book called Chasing the King of Hearts by Hanna Krall, which was published by Feminist Press a few years ago. And that, I think, even won a prize as a fiction book. And they consciously marketed it as a fiction book, even though it isn't.
The British publisher refused to believe it wasn't.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I was sort of involved in that, because one of the prizes it won was the Penn West or whatever, I don't know, the one that's in California, won that prize for translation, but that was open to anything. So it was there's fiction, there's poetry, there's anything that was, as long as the translator lived on the west coast or west of the Mississippi, it counted. But Publishers Weekly had that as one of the top 10 books of fiction for that year that it came up. And I remember we saw that together, and I was like, that makes no sense. I've actually read this book, and it explains very clearly what the history is and how she wrote it. So,
but we're so and this is something that comes up not just when you're translating from Polish, but from other languages as well. In the Anglophone tradition, we have this real fixation on having a hard division between fiction and nonfiction.
Yes.
And it's something that really doesn't carry over into other literatures. In France recently, they've had this whole wave of autofiction that's really toying with that boundary.
Well, that Annie Ernaux book that's shortlisted for the Man Booker International example.
Exactly. Yeah, I was thinking about that.
And that's been around for decades now too. French autofiction, especially by female writers. So it seems much more common, and people don't have a problem with it. I don't mean to interrupt, but we're related to that, and a really strong story for it. I may have told this before, but when we published Svetlana Alexievich's Voices from Chernobyl at Delki, and I was there working on that book, NPR wanted to have her on their show on All Things Considered to talk about the book, but then wouldn't, because we couldn't prove that it was all true, that it was all that she had the tapes of the spoken interviews that are in her book in the exact way that they're written in the book. That doesn't exist, and therefore it's not nonfiction. They didn't want to put her out there as someone who was writing nonfiction that wasn't backed up by facts that were checkable.
Yeah, and that's something that does happen in Polish reportage, is that these stories will be they never become fictionalized. They never really cross the border into being fiction, but they are crafted.
Yeah.
They are shaped, and so what she's doing is she's doing long interviews with people, which she is recrafting into monologues.
Yep.
There's no Polish reportage writer who does the same thing as what she does, but there are instances of that kind of technique in Polish reportage. And as you say, it's tricky because it's not, it hasn't crossed the boundary into fiction, but it's far enough away from what we're used to in nonfiction, where everything, as you say, is 100% fact checkable and fact checked.
Yeah.
That it can cause tensions and friction a little bit when you bring it over into English.
I have a lot of follow-up questions to that, but let me ask you guys first, just to keep framing this. Who are some of the major figures in Polish reportage that we should know about?
Very relevant to what you've just been saying about where the truth begins and ends.
Mm-hmm.
The real kind of founding father of Polish reportage is Ryszard Kapuscinski, who, again, was somebody who was writing around the censorship, originally writing about Poland and about things that were going on in Poland, and then became famous through his books, particularly the Shah of Shahs, about the Shah of Iran, and the Emperor about Haile Selassie, which could be read as an allegorical picture of the Polish Prime Minister of the time. So Gomulka, isn't it? Yeah. And and Kapuscinski has been heavily criticised, particularly by American journalists, among others, for being somewhat loose with the definition of the truth. And this is partly to do with the fact that he was writing around censorship, but it's also a sort of interpretation of how you tell the truth. And maybe you do it partly by building up a picture where the actual individual facts aren't going to be true if you check them, but what you're telling as a whole picture is the truth.
Yeah.
It's slightly to do with a different attitude, but of course some people are very upset by that as an approach, and there's been a huge amount of controversy about him. And a biography of him came out a few years ago by Szablowski, which caused a great deal of fuss here in Poland and also abroad, because it analysed the way he worked, and really was the first public, not exactly unmasking, but proper exposure of the fact that he used fact and fiction for a particular effect. And it depends how you feel about that, and how you feel about how this work is being presented to you. But of course he was a very great writer, and his books are absolutely brilliant, and people will continue to read them, and I can only highly recommend them. The Shadow of the Sun is an amazing analysis of Africa in a certain period, and then Travels with Herodotus, which is a more sort of autobiographical book about how he travelled around, and constantly with a copy of Herodotus, who's a perfect example of a reportage author, actually.
That's true, yeah.
Somebody who was collecting things from here and there and everywhere, and if you start going to the details of Herodotus, you probably find that quite a lot of it didn't stand up to fact-checking.
Right.
But,
I mean, of that generation, we also mentioned Hanna Krall, who is a Holocaust survivor and who specializes in stories of other Holocaust survivors. And there's also Małgorzata Szejnert, who I'm working on right now. I'm doing a book of hers called Ellis Island, which is about Ellis Island. Szejnert worked for 15 years at the head of the reportage division of the first free newspaper in Poland after the end of communism, and she was sort of the mentor of an entire generation of literary reportage writers. There's been sort of, since Kapuscinski, there's been kind of 3 generations, I think we've been saying, of these reportage writers, and Kapuscinski, Krall, and Szejnert are kind of that. It isn't the founding generation because it is an older tradition than that, but it's kind of the generation where it really came into its own, I think, as its own literary genre.
And the one that then encouraged and mentored the next generation.
Yeah, yeah.
So they are important. There's the most recent Kapuscinski in English is called Nobody Leaves, Impressions of Poland, translated by William Brand, and that's in the Penguin Classics series.
Oh.
And I highly recommend that because this was a book of his from the 1950s, which was not translated for a very long time, and it's beautifully done. It's a very good translation. It's a fascinating book about Poland in this period when it was coming out of Stalinism, just at the time of the thaw. So Kapuscinski really was having to be careful how he treated his material and how he presented things, because he was starting to talk about things which he couldn't have just before. So I recommend that book.
That's interesting. I didn't realize that one had just come out. I'll have to check that out because I really like him.
I can't remember. Yeah,
pretty recently.
Yeah.
Who's publishing the Ellis Island book? I know we've actually talked about that before.
Scribe.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That seemed like a really good project.
Yeah, it's amazing. She's a beautiful, beautiful writer. She's a really excellent stylist. And I've been, a couple of weeks ago, I was translating the endnotes and the bibliography. And it's amazing seeing an author's research up close like that, and just how thorough the work is that she's done. And especially in light of what Antonia was talking about, these controversies around the relationship of Polish reportage to the truth and to fact. I mean, I think that the fact that it was Kapuscinski who was found to have kind of tweaked things here and there and, said he was in places where he couldn't have been and so on. Because he was kind of the father figure of reportage, I think that kind of cast a shadow over the whole genre in a way that I think is unfair, actually. Yeah. And particularly now, there's a big move in Poland towards very thorough fact-checking and towards, sticking very, very closely with the truth and making sure that there can't be these kinds of controversies anymore.
That's interesting. So you mentioned that there are like 3 generations. Is there a way to define those generations, or is it just certain figures that were the leaders, or were there different techniques or approaches that they used?
I think you could talk about people who were writing under communism, people who were writing sort of in the transition period, and then people who were writing now. I think that might be a good way of dividing it up.
And each has encouraged and brought on the other. So, for instance, the journalists of the middle generation, the kind of my age, people who are now in their 50s, were very much mentored by Kapuscinski, Krall and Szejnet. And leading lights there are Maria Szczygiel, whose best known book in English is Gotland, which is a kind of portrait of the Czechs as a nation. Right. And then there is Wojciech Tochman, who has a book in English which is called, I know perfectly well because I translated it, it's called Lighting a Stone, and it's about the aftermath of the war in Bosnia. And then in that generation, there are other people such as Jacek Hugo Bader, who wrote a book called Kolimar Diaries and another called White Fever, both of which are about Russia. And then Kolimar Diaries is about Siberia, about the area where all the gold mines and the prison camps were. And then you've got Wojciech Jagielski, who I'm just translating a book of his right now. There's one called The Night Wanderers, which is all about child soldiers in Uganda, for instance.
We mentioned Artur Domosławski already, whose biography of Kapuscinski Antonia translated. There's also Lidia Ostałowska, who was one of the leading female journalists of that period, and I translated her book Watercolors, which is a book about, it's a biography of an artist who was an Auschwitz survivor, but is also really a cultural history of Auschwitz. Ostałowska specialized in marginalized communities in sort of the 90s and early 2000s in Poland, and wrote a lot about women and wrote a lot about the Roma community in Poland. She passed away very suddenly recently, which was extremely sad, and she has an enormous body of work that I would really love to do some more work on.
Interesting.
In the next generation, you've got some amazing people already, like Filip Springer, who Sean's been translating, who you mentioned. And then there's Witold Szablowski, who I'm translating, who wrote the book called Dancing Bears that did very well in the States. And he's got a new one coming. Then there's some writers who are just starting to break through in English. There's a writer called Magda Grzebalkowska, who's quite fantastic. She wrote a book which is a portrait of the year 1945. And that's going to be, it's only just been taken up by Pittsburgh University Press. And I think it's a student project to translate it, but it's a good one. I think good for them. And then there are some other writers who we've been trying to champion in English. We've been trying to find publishers for them. So there's Katarzyna Boni, who's written a book called Ganbare, which Sean can say something about.
Yeah, Ganbare is a book about the Fukushima disaster, and it's the tsunami and then the meltdown at the nuclear power plant there. And while it focuses on that specific disaster, it's really sort of a look at natural disasters and the culture of death and mourning in Japan. And it's a beautifully written sort of meditation seen through the eyes of people who interacted with this disaster in all kinds of different ways, including surviving it, losing loved ones in it, and supporting people who are grieving through it. It's a really wonderful book.
Which we have to talk about, but I'm hoping that that's going to be the second book in our Polish Reportage series. So everyone that's listening to this, back the fuck off.
You said about me.
Mine.
We heard you say that.
Yeah, exactly. No going back now, Chad.
There's no going back.
Right, I'm being the Polish publisher immediately.
Do it.
there are several other people who are very promising, and we've been doing our best to try and get them out there, and we'll get there.
One of the interesting things about this newest generation is that there is now so much infrastructure to support them in Poland. So there is a reportage institute now. There is a school of reportage that's doing the equivalent of like an MFA program for literary reportage writers, and a lot of these authors are products of that program. There's also, there's new magazines that are starting up. There's a magazine called Pismo, which is modeled on the New Yorker, and again is part of bringing that culture of hard fact-checking into Polish reportage. And so it's part of a boom in literary reportage that's going on in Poland right now. It's become a really commercially viable genre. It's become really popular. To the point, actually, where I was talking to Filip Springer earlier this week, and he was saying there's too much coming out, that there's such a fashion for it that, stuff is coming out even before it's really ready in a way, but that it just shows you how much of an appetite there is for this.
That was a question.
Three publishers who are doing a lot. So there's the Reportage Institute, which Sean mentioned, was founded by Mariusz Ścigiel and Wojciech Tochman, who I talked about, and also by Paweł Gorzlinski, who now runs a publishing company called Agora, which is connected with one of the leading newspapers, and he's publishing a lot of very good reportage. Then the Reportage Institute itself has its own publishing wing, run by Filip Springer's wife, Juliana Jonek, and that's called Dowody na istnienie, which is the title of a Hannah Krall book, which means proof of existence. And then there's a publisher called Czarne, which is owned by husband and wife Monika Schneiderman and Andrzej Staszuk, who's a very well-known writer himself. And they were the first champions of reportage, and they're still publishing a lot of it. So those are the three leading publishers for it.
There's I have a couple of questions, but one thing that I think stands out, I think might surprise some people who are listening, but the idea that we were talking about Polish reportage, and it's not that they're only writing about Poland, which seems like a very obvious thing to state when you've read any of these books, but in some ways I think that people's expectation is, it's about Polish history, and there are a lot of works that are about Polish history, but you're talking about a book about Japan, book about all over, that they're not confined. And related to that, I think Dancing Bears is a good example of and I'm almost done with it. I've got 60 pages left. So correct me if I'm wrong about this, but how it sort of uses different techniques to be the different craft of writing to get across a point. So the first half of it is all about these individual Bulgarian bear dancing trainers, and people who had owned bears and taught them to dance and performed with them, having as Bulgaria joins the European Union, and that's outlawed, how they try and take these bears away from the people, put them into a special sanctuary, and take care of the bears at a high expense, which is kind of wild compared to what's going on with the other people in Bulgaria, and that the bears continue to dance even though they're not supposed to.
Well, he's using that as an allegory, really.
Right.
I hate to say it, as somebody who knows quite a lot about bears, quite incidentally, bears love standing up on their back legs and showing off, whether they danced in the past or not. It's a kind of thing bears do. Yeah. However, he uses it as an allegory for people in countries that have emerged out of totalitarian systems. So in a way, he's exploiting the bears a bit himself, but it's a very interesting way of analysing those countries by making this analogy.
Yeah, that's what I was going to... So that first half focuses on the very individual, the bears and that individual situation, and then the second half is all these different countries and different people who have come out of that system, and it starts to set up these parallels, but it's not over the top, beaten down on you. It's just set forth that way and uses the same chapter headings and constructs itself in this very well-structured way to get that apart. And it's not all about Poland. It's about...
Well, that's one of these features of reportage, the Polish reportage, is that they don't hammer into your head what you're supposed to think.
Yeah.
A lot of it is between the lines, and you are left to draw your own conclusions. And one of the features of the reportage that we haven't actually mentioned, but that we're so used to it, we don't even think about it anymore, is that very often these things are written in quite a sparse economical style, where they don't put tons of adjectives and tons of, well, some of them do, but mostly it's written in a quite clipped way, it's actually very hard to translate.
Yeah.
I always say it's a bit like some amazing work of modern art where someone's taken a brush and just gone slap, swap, plop, and you've got some amazing painting. But then when you're translating it, you've got to keep that lightness of touch. And you mustn't over-clutter it as a translator. You've got to keep listening. And it looks very simple, the text, but it's actually hard to keep the simplicity. Hannah Krall's one of the hardest to do. So Filip Boehm, who's translated her, and I read a translation, it hasn't been published yet, one that Jennifer Croft did. They both caught it. They've got that lightness. But it isn't easy to do that.
Krall talks about, why she writes that way. She says basically that the more kind of emotionally intense the material is, the more stripped back the writing should be. So it doesn't get in the way of the material. You're not trying to manipulate your audience into feeling something because of the way that you've written this. The material should really speak for itself.
But it's very subtle, and these people are often real masters of this economical style.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So you mentioned the school and like the MFA program for it. Is that the sort of thing that they must? So that's being taught there. This sort of style, these sort of like approaches.
Yeah. Yes, and
so
they're quite short courses. I think they do it twice a year or something. Okay. I myself have gone and blathered at the poor students before now to explain to them what the issues are for a translator in this sort of writing, and how I always wish they would record their interviews and things like that. Sometimes they'll have. This is a problem from the translator's point of view, that here you have books written in Polish which you're translating to English. Because Polish isn't exactly the world's #1 most common language, very often they're conducting interviews in a third country in English. And then they're writing things down in Polish, and then you're translating it back into English, and you feel like you're doing Chinese whispers in the end. So I'm always encouraging them to use the most direct method they can. Find somebody in Albania who knows Polish, if you're going to interpret. Try and do things with the least number of language steps.
Yeah.
It'll be the truest, be as close to what your interlocutor said as possible.
That makes a lot of sense, and hadn't really thought about that, but that's true that it is like going through so many forms of translation before it even gets to English.
Szablowski's new book is a very good example, because Witold Szablowski has written a wonderful book which is being published by Penguin next year, and it's called How to Feed a Dictator. And he had this great idea. He went and found 5 people who are still alive in different parts of the world, each of whom was the chef for a famous dictator. So we have the chef for Fidel Castro, we have the chef for Idi Amin, Enver Hoxha of Albania, Saddam Hussein, and Pol Pot.
Wow.
And in most cases, he managed to find interpreters who knew Polish. So he has an Albanian for the Albanian chef talking to him in Polish. Then Spanish-Polish was easy, and so was Arabic-Polish for Saddam Hussein. But when it came to Khmer and Luo, because Idi Amin's chef was a Kenyan, that was harder. So, but he did his best to be as direct as possible. And they are absolutely stunning, these conversations. So Pol Pot's chef is the only one who was a woman. She was madly in love with him, probably had some sort of relationship with him because he seems to have been a dreadful womanizer. Yeah. And she describes him in this way. In each case, he lets these chefs just talk. So he's not interrupting them. You get their monologue. And this woman talks about Pol Pot in these superlatives, and he sounds like a rock star. And you start being mesmerized by her. And when he's out of the scene, you're thinking, when's he coming back? And starting to be dreamy about this genocidal monster. I mean, it's incredibly effective. It's the most chilling book. And then every now and then he'll go and talk to some victim of these dictators, and you get their side of it and what they were eating while the chef was preparing whatever for Saddam Hussein, what the victims had to eat. It is a most stunning way of analysing what these dictators were like and how totalitarianism works through something as commonplace as food that we all share and that's so ordinary and unthreatening. So I recommend that book, which will be out next year, How to Feed a Dictator.
That sounds great. That sounds really great.
Yeah. I want to loop back to something that we touched on briefly, Chad, which is that you were talking about with Szablowski's other book with Dancing Bears, how it didn't beat you over the head. And Antonia mentioned that these authors don't do the analysis for you. They don't do the thinking for you. Mm-hmm. Just in terms of the historical context of reportage, again, this is something that grew out of the relationship with censorship under communism.
Right.
They didn't want to put analysis because if there was analysis, then they could be accused of being subversive or what have you.
Right.
But it's something that has really stuck around in this genre just because it makes for really good storytelling when you let the story work on its own and when you let the reader think on its own, on their own. And so I think that's one of the interesting things about this genre is that it grew up under very specific cultural conditions, but it's lasted past the end of those conditions, and it's because it arrived at a place that just makes it good literature apart from anything else.
Right. So what is the status? You said that there's so many books coming out and like so many new publications. Are there awards just for reportage, and how does it fall within the Polish readership? Is it equal to poetry or fiction, or is it considered better, less? Like, how does it fit?
Pretty much on a par with the other main genres. It is a big genre.
Yes,
here.
yeah.
People love
popular,
it and really love it. And it has a very broad range. So we've been talking about these books which are essentially either about issues in Poland or about other countries. But there's quite a broad definition of reportage. So some things are really much more general kinds of non-fiction or biography or whatever. Uh-huh. And then there is a big prize, which is the Ryszard Kapuscinski Prize. Okay. And that happens once a year, and that's run by the Kapuscinski Foundation, I think. Yeah. And it has books in translation as well as books written by Polish authors.
Interesting.
And then the major literary prize in Poland is called the Nike, which happens once a year, and that's for all genres. So that has poetry and reportage in it as well as fiction. Right. Ditto, you were saying, the Paszport Polityka, which is the prize for, it has different categories, one of which is non-fiction.
And it goes to authors or to artists, really, rather than to specific works. But it's but as Antonia was saying, they're like the two major literary prizes in Poland, and they treat reportage on a completely on par with fiction and with poetry. And it's interesting because just a couple of years ago, there was the first reportage winner of the Nike Prize. And this was a bit of a sensation in Poland because I'm trying to remember the story that I was told, but one of the founders of the prize had said that no reportage title would ever win the Nike.
Wow.
But it went to a book by an author of one of those second generation writers, a guy called Cezary Łazarewicz, a book called To Leave No Trace, about a notorious case of police brutality under communism in the 1980s. So yeah, I mean, I think I think that gives you a good sense of the esteem that reportage is held in Poland. It's really not seen as something separate. It's seen as an integral part of the literary scene in this country, and it's very popular.
And actually, I noticed the lack of awards for non-fiction in our part of the world.
Yeah.
Because I've been translating such a lot of this reportage, and now Sean's doing it too. And I'm often thinking about these books that I adore and have put a lot of work into. I'm thinking, there's nowhere for these to be competing in that way, which is a shame. I mean, there are some. In Britain, there are one or two. There's a Russian book prize, which is very good, and I've had books listed there. And then one of the Dancing Bears was on the Dolman Travel Award Prize in Britain. I've had other books on there. And there's a serious prize in Britain which keeps changing its name, the one Filip Sands won for East West Street. I can't remember what it's called, but it's a kind of non-fiction.
Yeah, I was just thinking
there aren't very many out there. It's that most big prizes are just for fiction. Yeah.
Right.
Some of the categories, some prizes are starting to open up their categories and to have more. I think in the States you have there's National Book Awards. They have quite a broad remit down.
As I was going to say, they're fiction and non-fiction, but no poetry.
Good.
Which is interesting. And then Sean, you should know this, but the National Translation Award given out through Alta, that's open to fiction and non-fiction or just fiction?
I believe so, yeah.
I can't remember. But then what occurred to me is like the one that's always open to translations, but they don't necessarily make it onto the list that often, is the National Book Critics Circle Awards. And they have 6 categories, and I don't know where these sort of books would fit. I guess they just nonfiction, because they have like nonfiction, biography, autobiography, criticism. Like there's like, they have those 4 categories.
It's interesting because it's not like we lack a tradition of long form journalism in the United States. It's very popular that those books sell an enormous number of copies, but what these Polish journalists are writing is really, it stylistically is very far removed from what those kinds of writers are writing in the United States. And so I think that it's, just the fact that the approach is so different, I think kind of moves it out of people's comfort zone in a way.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Speaking of books, and maybe a couple specific questions before I let you guys go. So you're working on Foucault in Warsaw for us. Tell us about this.
Well, yeah, sure. I really love this book, and I'm so excited that you guys are doing it. So this is a reportage debut. It was published by Proof of Existence Publishing House, the one that's linked to the Reportage Institute. And it's an instance of what the Poles call historical reportage. So it's the story is that Michel Foucault, the famous French philosopher and author of The History of Sexuality, spent a year in Warsaw at the end of the 1950s when he was finishing his doctoral thesis. And he basically needed somewhere to live while he was working on this thesis. And he had a friend who had connections at Warsaw University, and he came and he taught in the French department for a year. And at this period in Poland, the government sort of secret police were very focused on suppressing social vices like homosexuality. And homosexuality was not illegal in Poland, unlike in the Soviet Union, but it was viewed kind of in the same category as prostitution or drug addiction. It was something that really needed to be tamped down. And Foucault was really very openly gay and was very engaged with the gay community in Warsaw at that time, and found himself targeted by the secret police. And the story went that the secret police recruited a young man to pose as a prostitute and seduce Foucault, and then as sort of a honeypot operation. And the police arrested both of them and charged him with prostitution and threw him out of the country. Foucault didn't talk about this very much in the rest of his life, but rumors about this had circulated in the Warsaw gay scene for years and years and years. Oh. And the author of this book, an academic called Remigiusz Ryziński, finally decided to find out if it was true or not. So the secret police archives in Poland are open. Anybody can go into them. And he figured if it was a secret police operation, there would be a file on Foucault. And so he goes into the archives and he hunts around all over the place and doesn't find a file on Foucault. But what he does discover is that if you were a gay man in Warsaw in the late 50s and early 60s, you were either being followed by the secret police or you were informing for the secret police so that they wouldn't follow you. And so inadvertently, almost the entire gay scene in Warsaw in this period is extensively documented in these secret police records.
This is wild.
And so what he does is the book kind of takes you through his research process, and he's trying to the central plot point of the book is that he's trying to identify who this man was who was recruited to seduce Foucault. But in the process of getting there, he takes you through all of the main characters of this period, all of the bars where they hung out, all of the restaurants and cafes where they hang out, all of the public toilets where they hooked up. And it's this amazing portrait of Warsaw at a really dynamic period in its history. The city was still being rebuilt after the war. It took a really long time. This is during the thaw. It's right after the end of Stalinism. Sort of cultural life is coming back to Poland in a really dynamic way. And a lot of the people he identifies through these files were prominent actors, prominent authors, people who were major figures in the cultural scene. And it was often an open secret that they were gay,
Yeah.
And one of the most interesting parts of this book to me is that he tracks down, Ryziński tracks down people who are still alive, who remember the scene then and who knew Foucault or knew people who knew Foucault. And he goes and he meets them and he interviews them. And they're really, they're these... They're these living historical documents, these people. They remember a whole subculture that really doesn't exist anymore and that uses a language that doesn't exist anymore and that has a whole different perspective on gender and on sexuality that we really don't have anymore. And I think it's just a remarkable picture of pre-Stonewall gay life behind the Iron Curtain. There's been a certain amount of scholarship like this coming out in Poland in the last couple of years, and notably there was a novel called Love Town by Michał Witkowski, which was translated by Bill Martin several years ago, which takes place in a similar period in Poznan, I think.
It's Wrocław.
Wrocław. But that deals with some of the same slang and sort of some of the same atmosphere. But it's exciting to me that... as a queer person, it's exciting to me that this is history that's really coming to the fore in Poland now, and it's something that people are really engaging with, and we're finding all of these amazing stories that have been kind of swept under the carpet or pushed into the closet, if you like, for so long.
It's fascinating hidden world, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So I can't wait for that book. I think that's gonna be super, super fun to read and to publish and market and everything. So
there was an excerpt of it in Words Without Borders in the queer issue. I can't remember if it was this year or last year, but if you Google it, it'll come right up.
I'll link to it in the show notes too. I'll try and write down as many of the things that you guys mentioned on the post, but my spelling is pretty rough, so I'll find enough of them. So. But Antonia, is there a project that you're working on right now or that you just finished that you want to promote?
Yes, actually, I've been doing some work on a book that only came out last month, and it's called The Roosters Crow, The Dogs Whine, and it's about Cambodia, and it's by Wojciech Tochman, and he in his career has somewhat specialized in the aftermath of genocide, a jolly topic, which, everyone should face up to now and then. And as I mentioned, he wrote a book about Bosnia, Like Eating a Stone, and he wrote a book about Rwanda also, called Today We're Going to Draw Death. But this book is about Cambodia, and it's a very interesting way of looking at Cambodian society. He went to live in Cambodia for a couple of years, and there's an NGO which specializes in psychiatric care of people who live in Cambodian villages. There's very little help. There's very little in the way of psychiatry at all in the whole of Cambodia. And he found this NGO, and they have people who are trained to go and try and help mentally ill patients in remote places. Because what happens in these places is that people think if you've gone mad through illness, that you have devils in you and you're possessed, or you've had magic spells cast on you. So essentially they lock people up in cages and they throw boiling water over them or come up with a lot of mumbo jumbo, and of course it's useless and horrible. And if only they would believe that the person just has to take medicine and has to be kept an eye on for a while until they get used to taking the medicine themselves, they can live a perfectly normal life and be perfectly okay. So what this NGO does is just that. It travels to these places and tries to persuade the families or the local people that these poor, imprisoned, really suffering psychiatric patients can be helped. And so he travelled with the main psychiatrist, who's an extraordinary woman, and he describes various different places and different cases and what the attitudes are to these people. And then there's a middle section of the book where he has lots of kind of vignettes of the lives of different people who have been affected by the wars in Cambodia in different ways, and how their lives have shaped up since, and what it's like to be, I don't know, disabled or in other ways indigent or having a difficult time as a result of the wars. And then the third part of the book, he revisits some of the people from the first part, And some of them have been cured. Some of them are okay, and some of them are not. In some cases, it hasn't really worked. Right. But it's kind of hopeful in that at the end of the book, there are people who've been cured, and you feel maybe there's help for Cambodian society as a whole. Maybe there is some healing that can happen.
Wow.
And it's a pretty tough look at a country, but it's fascinating. And I've been preparing some material on that book with a view to finding it a publisher in English.
Oh, okay. That's what I was wondering. I was going to ask if it had come out yet or not. That sounds really interesting too.
It's out in Polish, but
right.
I think you've got some material on it. So when you get around to it, see what you think.
Absolutely. Is there anything else that you guys want to add about Polish Reportage, being Polish translators?
There is such a lot of good stuff, and this is something that's just growing and growing, and just to encourage people to read it and investigate it and explore.
Yeah. I'm going to try and put together a post next week with around Dancing Bears that has a list of just different titles that are available in English that people can check out, and little quick summaries of them.
Well, let us know what you find, and we can add to it.
Perfect. Yeah, that would be great, because it isn't super easy to research, but
yeah, if you have a start, Sean and I can beef up your list for you.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Well, thank you guys for doing this. It's been really fun to talk to you.
Your interest, it's wonderful. Thank you.
And if anyone's looking to contact you guys about books that they might want to publish, they can find you online pretty easily, right?
Yep, very easily. Facebook or are you easy to find online?
Yeah, you can find me on the website of my translators collective, Sedilla and Company, at www.sedilla.company.
Yeah, I'll link to that too.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you guys.